Welcome back to Talking Foreign Affairs with Adil Kader. With the UN General Assembly recently kicking off, my next guest had the distinct honor of leading the body a couple of years ago, Mrs. María Fernanda Espinosa. Mrs. María Fernanda Espinosa served as the president of the UN General Assembly from 2018 to 2019, becoming only the fourth woman to hold the role. Prior to that, she served 2 terms as Ecuador Minister for Foreign Affairs, leading international negotiations on environmental action and climate change. We will be talking with Mrs. Espinosa on her role as the UN General Assembly President and the role of women in international affairs. Currently, she is an advocate for gender equality through GWL Voices for Change and Inclusion, an advocacy group for multilateralism and gender equality. Mrs. Espinosa, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here with you, Adil. Thank you for the invitation.
I want to start, before we go into your role as the UN General Assembly President, I want to start off with your days in Ecuador. You were the Foreign Minister, Defense Minister, Permanent Representative to the UN, and you had various other roles. How did all these roles help you in shaping your worldview to eventually becoming UNGA President?
Well, I think that since the very early stages of my career, the multilateral scene was the space, where I worked as an environmental advocate in all my years working for IUCN, the World Conservation Union. And when I became a public servant, I think that there was a lot of commitment to world affairs, and that started my career, of course. And in all the different positions I have served, I think that issues on international peace and security, issues of climate and conflict and environmental security were on top of the priorities. I had the privilege to serve as permanent representative ambassador to both the UN in New York and Geneva. And I had, a very clear view of what this world of multilateralism was about. And that was, I think, extremely helpful for to inform and support the work as president of the General Assembly. And of course, being a woman, I think it's a double challenge and a double opportunity. I was both the first female ambassador in New York, the first female ambassador in Geneva, and as you said very well, Adil, only the fourth woman to serve as president of the UN General Assembly in 78 years of history. So I think that that's a privilege, but also a great opportunity to advocate for a more gender balanced international system.
You mentioned, you highlighted the work of your work trying to advocate for gender equality, and we'll touch a bit about that later on in the interview. But speaking on your experience, you said that you had lots of experience of multilateralism, and I'm sure when you were foreign minister, there was a lot of work you had to do on bilateral ties, working with different countries. Now, the diplomacy you learned from that experience as foreign minister, as PR to the UN, was a lot of that applicable from taking it to UNGA president, or was being UNGA president a whole new kettle of fish? I mean, for starters, you had to be more neutral. You couldn't be sided. You're not representing a country. You're there representing 193 countries. What were some of the similarities and differences between being UNGA president and the diplomacy you practiced as foreign minister?
Well, I think good diplomacy is about dealing with dissent, dealing with very diverse perspectives and points of views. Diplomacy is not about just talking about the people that think like you or have the same priorities.
Yeah.
On the contrary, I think it's bringing together different opinions, different perspectives, and finding common ground. That's, I think, the beauty and the challenge of diplomacy. And I think that the center of world diplomacy is the Organization of the United Nations, and perhaps the most universal and representative body, which is the UN General Assembly. So I think that my previous experience with the UN, but as foreign minister twice, really helped provide, the elements and the background and the experience to deal, with the main body of the world diplomacy at the UN, and of course to abide by the procedures, by the rule of law, to find common ground among countries, to always think about the common good, to be very active in terms of improving the working methods of the organization. That's very much in the hands of the president of the General Assembly. And you have to navigate. We're not naive. We are living very difficult times, even when I was the president. So dealing with complexity and with diversity of views, in bringing a room together of 193 on issues of critical importance, or climate, or refugees, or migration, or peace and security issues that are also in the realm of the work of the General Assembly. I think it's a great challenge, but I think it's an honor and a privilege. I think that I was so privileged to be able to serve as president of the General Assembly.
You mentioned about migration, and one of your key achievements as president of the UN General Assembly was playing a key role in the Global Compact for Migration. Can you just go into details in regards to how you got agreement on this? Because this is a very touchy issue for many countries around the world. So how did you go about negotiating this?
Well, I have to be very frank with you, Adil, but it was one of the most complicated, pieces of work, because there was a huge gap in views and priorities and perspectives about migration. And I think that that's when you need, diplomacy at its best, And the issue is that migration is a reality. It's a global reality that is happening as we speak. And the compact on migration was a framework to help countries take decisions on their own domestic policies, but to establish a global framework, a minimum common denominator, to ensure that the human rights of people on the move were respected, and that migration was orderly, regular, safe, and an option and not an obligation. Unfortunately, we're seeing, with increasing conflicts, with climate change and emissions on the rise, unfortunately, displacement of people is perhaps more intense than ever. And we don't have only, climate migrants. We have migrants due to armed conflict, but also to poverty. We have migrants that are forced to leave their countries to look for better opportunities for them and their families. And unfortunately, we are in an era of intense migration. It's not going to improve, and we need to get organized, because it is a global issue. And we're seeing situations where, losses of lives, human trafficking, violence against women and girls due to uncontrolled and conditions of migration that are really harming, the human rights of people on the move. And this has to be a part of our new life, people moving due to different circumstances and reasons. And believe me, no one, that lives a safe, healthy, prosperous life wants to migrate. If they want to migrate, it's because to other reasons, but not forced to migrate. So I think the Compact on Migration provided this overall general framework. Of course, to reach agreement was difficult. Even regional groupings that have often homogeneous positions on that. They had very divided opinions and positions. So to bring together the voices of 193, considering this very this big complexity and diversity of positions was a big challenge. But we do have the compact. I think that it is a very useful framework, and we have to use it. We have to use it to face what we are experiencing in today's world. So, hundreds of millions of people moving, and even conservative data on climate-related migration speaks about 1.5 billion people migrating due to climate reasons by 2050. So we need to be prepared. We need to use this compact. That wasn't an easy challenge when I was the president.
Absolutely. We have had other previous guests on our show that have raised the same sentiments you have on this topic. And it did sound like a big challenge trying to get all 193 members on the same page. But at the same time, with UN General Assemblies, unlike UN Security Council resolutions, they aren't as legally binding. So the lack of enforcement, some critics argue, diminish its effectiveness. How do you respond to these concerns that with not just the Global Compact on Migration, with other major landmark resolutions the UN General Assembly has passed, unlike other bodies within the UN, because it's non-binding, the effectiveness is impacted? What are your responses to this?
Well, this issue of a resolution being legally binding or not, I think that we need to rethink a little bit the categories, because, for example, the resolution that established the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda came out of the UN General Assembly. And we cannot say that they are not legally binding, but they are, our agreed roadmap for the future of sustainable development. The same goes for the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement on climate is a framework that emerged from the UN General Assembly. Same for the Millennium Development Goals. Same for agreements on pandemics and universal health coverage. These are, I would say, they become, in a way, international law. They are policy frameworks for countries to follow. Unfortunately, some of the decisions of the Security Council are not properly implemented. So I think we should see this in a more systemic way. And the UN in general is the platform to shape international law. And I think that countries should deliver on their commitments. And for that, it's not only the responsibility of governments, but of societies as a whole. It's not an issue of only governments taking the right decisions, which is critically important, but it's societies owning the decisions and establishing mechanisms of co-responsibility.
I can definitely relate to that, because during my time when I was at the UN, I know the UN plays a key role in getting voices from civil societies, NGOs, young leaders to come and give speeches. So it's good to see the UN in that regard get more and more people involved with these resolution negotiations. Just moving back to your time as president of the UN General Assembly, you were the fourth woman president of the UN General Assembly. It's still only been 4 women since then. Why is that statistic so low, 4 out of 78?
Well, I think that it's a systemic problem, and not only for the presidency of the UN General Assembly. We have never had a female Secretary General of the UN in 78 years. And even though the current Secretary General has really, committed to gender parity within the system, there is a lot of homework ahead of us. The organization that I have the privilege to serve as executive director, GWL, we produce a flagship report called Numbers Matter, where we track senior level appointments in the international system within the UN, but also, beyond the UN, the international organizations. And we tracked the 33 most important international organizations and realized that, for example, 13 of them never had a female leading these organizations. And we see that usually it's like one exception, and then the rest are all men before and after, for example. And we track hopefully the improvement of the statistics. Unfortunately, it's not an incremental improvement. It is sometimes we see regression. We see, low points. We are experiencing currently a low point, in spite, as I mentioned, of the efforts of the current Secretary General to have a gender parity at the top level positions in the organization. That the UN has achieved that, but if you look a little bit down, then the gap starts to widen. And if you look at other organizations, for example, at the World Bank, organizations that are really emblematic in still, are waiting for a woman to lead. So, and I think there are structural hurdles. There are a cultural impediments sometimes. Usually, what you hear is that it's about merit, and believe me that there are women for all these positions with enough merit, but to change a system, to change an institutional culture is not always easy. And it's what we have witnessed from GWL Voices is that there is increasing awareness, that there is increasing people of the social movement, civil society, are very alert and following what is happening in senior appointments in the international system. And we're looking at WTO, other trade organizations, regional multilateral organizations. And I have to tell you that there is a long way to go. And it is not only about having the numbers right. We are 50% plus of the world's population. And it's not about just having the numbers right. It's about different styles of leadership, different perspectives. It is about effectiveness. It is about power sharing. And that's why it's not as easy as it sounds. It is about, power sharing. And I think it's a win-win to have gender parity in the international system. It's a win-win because we can bring a lot of wealth and experience and wisdom to decisions at the highest international level.
You mentioned about that report, and one very eye-opening statistic was that just 12% of the top jobs in the multilateral organizations have ever been held by women. So that's quite a startling number. And you mentioned just briefly in your answer about the selection process. So let's go to the UN Secretary General. There's never been a UN Women's Secretary General, but the selection process is essentially, some critics argue, very narrow, where it's essentially just the Security Council and the P5 that have power in regards to who's going to get the next top job. Have you ever had any, when you were UNGA president, did you have any thoughts or ideas to how the UNSG selection process can be changed?
Well, I think that it is about time to have a female Secretary General for the first time in the UN history. And it of course, it very much depends on the decisions that member states take, especially the Security Council. But I think that the international environment has understood that it is the time for a woman. It is the time for Madam Secretary General. And there are many, voices out there advocating for that to happen. And I'm very optimistic because I think that the overall environment is conducive to make it happen. And believe me that there are many potential candidates out there that would perform, an incredible job.
And in the report as well, it goes over the cultural change needed. And you've been a prominent advocate for gender equality over the years. And the article not just goes over the challenges about getting into office, but also once they're in office, trying to maintain that influence. Can you share any insights or challenges you've encountered in your career and how you've overcome that?
Well, I think that I'm really an optimist, and I really hope that the times when we said, I was the first, and you say, oh, breaking the glass ceiling, it's going to be absolutely unnecessary, because it's going to be natural. A demographic justice, but also the issue of quality and balance and power sharing. And I think that it is difficult, and sometimes we take it for granted. And the truth is, when a woman is appointed to a high-level positions, even in government at the national level, internationally, expectations are higher. And we need to prove that we are fit for purpose, that we do have the qualifications and the merits to occupy a particular position. And that often doesn't happen with men. They don't have to prove their abilities and their experience and their qualifications as much as we have to. And perhaps that also forces us to deliver better, to be more effective, to show that we are capable. And that has been, I would say, a little bit of the marker of my own career. And I don't do it only because I'm responsible and I want to perform the best I can, but because I feel the responsibility for the generations to come. And I interact a lot with younger professionals in the areas of diplomacy in universities, and they really need to see that it is possible, that they are entitled, that they have the right to be in high-level positions, to ambition, to be at the top level of organizations. And sometimes they are afraid because it's hard for women. We cannot deny the fact that there is not only higher standards for us when we are in positions of high-level decision making, but there is also, violence against women in politics, for example, women in diplomacy. We have seen so many examples just recently with prime ministers, heads of state and government that are female. So it is challenging, but it doesn't mean that we cannot be strong enough to face and respond and do what we need to do. And this is a strong call for younger generations to dare and to be entitled, because we have the right. We have the right, we have the capacities, and we can deliver and perform as good as, or sometimes better, I have to say, than men. But this is not a battle. I think it is about a common and share a project of a more equal society, and that is true, of course, for the international system as well. But I won't pretend that it's not difficult, that there is a lot of personal and family investment into projects of high ambition, and you have to develop a lot of strength when you are in positions, in high level positions, both in government and internationally. But we should not younger women should be I would say committed, driven, and not afraid, even if because women, we are strong, we are not vulnerable, we are strong, and I think it's an invitation and a call for younger generations to aspire and to dream about being really at the highest possible level, nationally, but also in the international scene.
So on that note, do you think that the next UN Secretary General after Antonio Guterres could be a woman?
Well, it has to be. I think it is time. It's going to be, more than 80 years of the organization. I think that 80 years is about time. And as I said, I see that there is an international environment that is leaning towards that historical justice, and I think it is time for a woman to become the next Secretary General of the UN.
Are there any particular individuals you hope to see running?
Well, there are many out there, and believe me, very, very well qualified with a great potential. And the UN really, needs a profound retooling that has started with a very ambitious project of the current Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda report and the Summit of the Future next year, that we have high expectations of a strong outcome that is going to set the tone for, I would say, future structural and profound reforms. And to deliver on these reforms in the near future, I think it would be wonderful to have a woman lead after the current Secretary General.
Sure, and we hope to see that happen. And just as we're approaching time, this will be our final question. So especially for our younger listeners and our students who have an interest in the United Nations, going over your time as UNGA president, can you just explain to our audience the selection and the election process, how you came into office, how the selection works within the regional groups?
Well, the selection of the president of the General Assembly, it's voted, or either by unanimity when there is one single candidate. In my case, there was a vote because there were two candidates, and I think it was extremely healthy as a process. Because there is an interactive dialogue with member states, and there is no voting by regions. It's a universal voting in the General Assembly, 193 votes, and of course a simple majority is what can. It's what you need to be elected. In this case, I had the privilege to be elected with more than 2/3 of the votes of the General Assembly. And I said sometimes to have more than one candidate is extremely healthy because it allows for a greater engagement for member states to have choices in for different candidates to really show that their capacities and their priorities and their ability to lead with the most representative body of the UN system. So I thought the very process of election and the voting was extremely healthy for the system, good for countries. And often what we have is one candidate that is elected or appointed by unanimity, which is also okay. It means that the process has gone in a smooth way, and then you have reached agreement over one candidate that is proposed by the regional group that has the turn, because it rotates by region. What we're asking for from GWL Voices, and has been echoed by several heads of state and government during the last General Assembly, is gender alternation for the presidency of the General Assembly. We don't think that that's so difficult to keep the regional rotation, of course, but to also introduce the element of a gender rotation. For example, the president of Slovenia, the president of Botswana, the Spanish president, in their address to the UN General Assembly during High Level Week, they mentioned that and they echoed our proposal. And I think it's doable. It's going to bring a lot of oxygen and dynamism to the General Assembly, and we really hope that it is something that that member states can agree to. That would be, I would say, a very symbolic, strong, and doable change within the procedures of the UN General Assembly. So let's hope that this idea of a gender alternation will fly. We see that there's a lot of sympathy in many countries, and I really hope it happens, because it's going to change the pictures you see at the entrance of the UN General Assembly hall with only 4 women. Then you will have, alternation between a man and a woman in the future, which is how the world demographics looks like, how the world looks like. And I think that the UN and every international organization should very much look like the world looks, in terms of priorities, in terms of the working methods, in terms of the efficiency and the relevance that is expected, not only in the international high-level diplomatic scene, but expected from people on the ground.
I think our audience would really appreciate that answer, especially how you mentioned the work GWL does in lobbying with some of these leaders. And it just goes to show that you don't have to be a head of state to lobby at the UN. Any NGOs, groups such as GWL can bring about positive change. But on that note, Mrs. Espinosa, thank you so much for your insightful advice, your feedback on your extremely thorough career. And I'm sure our audience have learned a lot about gender equality on global affairs.
Thank you, Adil, for this opportunity, and I think that the current situation in world affairs today requires a strong, vibrant, modern, and effective multilateral system with the United Nations at the center. And I think it is a shared and collective responsibility to make it happen. So I'm very happy to have shared this time with you, and thank you.